The letter NUN is another of the letters that has two forms. The normative NUN, as you can see in the shape, is bent over, whereas the final NUN is elongated. In the words of the sages, both of these forms represent a servant, a faithful servant. The word in Hebrew for faithful, ne'eman, begins with the bent over NUN and ends with the elongated NUN. The bent over shape represents the servant in a state of humbleness, in a state of subservience. Subservience in this sense, a good connotation. Because perhaps the highest compliment that God pays Moshe is he calls him a Eved Ne'eman, a faithful servant. He says, there's no one in my house who is a faithful servant like Moshe. Usually we think of servitude as a very negative thing. But in relationship to serving God, to being connected to God, to taking upon oneself the yoke of the kingdom of heaven, so being a servant is the highest description that we could have. Here we see again, just like the letter Daled, where Daled also represented a poor one, humbleness, and it was connected to David, who has two Daleds in his name. Here again we have Moshe, the greatest teacher of all of Jewish history, being described in the Torah as the most humble man on the face of the earth. This is a paradigm of Jewish leadership, where the strength of the leader comes from a state of being a servant, of being humble. Now this is further talked about in the Gemara in a discussion in the Talmud of Sanhedrin about the names of Mashiach, the future ultimate leader of the Jewish people. And one of the opinions is that the name of the Mashiach will be NUN, which comes from the letter Nun. And it comes from a verse in Psalms relating to the future Mashiach. Yunun Shemo. His name will be Yunun. So we see that the letter paradoxically represents a bent-over servant who is actually the strongest of all, who is the leader. This now relates to the number of Nun, which is 50. 50 is the Jubilee year. After 7 sabbatical cycles, 49 years, is the 50th Jubilee year. It's called the Year of Freedom, and it represents a state of redemption. Interesting enough, one of the things that happens in the Jubilee year is all indentured servants go free. It's a time of freedom, time of redemption. And this is connected to the idea of Nun altogether. The Torah is given on the 50th day of coming out of Egypt. We count 49 days of the Omer, and the 50th day is the receiving of the Torah on Sinai. Receiving the Torah on Sinai is the ultimate expression of receiving upon ourselves, the Jewish people, what's called the yoke of the kingdom of heaven. And we said before we receive the Torah, Na'aseh v'nishma, and this represents our total faith in God. A meaningful meditation for the letter Nun would be to connect to one's inner sense of humbleness and yet feel the power and the strength to be a leader, to receive upon oneself the opportunity to serve God in this world, and to know that ultimately this is our source of strength.